So it's no secret that the Gilded Age is back, and this is the very first season that I've gotten a chance to talk about since its premiere in January of 2022 over on HBO. My boyfriend and I had actually come across this series and decided to check it out together, and we watched the entirety of the first season, but then I noticed him starting to get a little disinterested, so I just started watching it by myself, and it became a little bit of a binge moment for me until, of course, I came to the end of season 2. But it has definitely become a period drama that I didn't know I needed in my life. But now here we are, gathered around the campfire to talk about season 3. And don't be afraid to share your thoughts in the comments, of course. This is a community effort, but let's introduce a little bit of our cast. So we have Carrie Coon as Bertha Russell, Louisa Jacobson as Marion, Christine Baranski as Agnes Van Ryn, Morgan Spector as George Russell, Cynthia Nixon as Ada Brooke, Danae Benton as Peggy Scott, Harry Richardson as Larry Russell, and Taysa Famiga as Gladys Russell. Of course, there are some new faces like Felicia Rashad as Elizabeth Kirkland and Jordan Donica as her son, Dr. William Kirkland. But now we gotta talk because I have some thoughts and we need to get into them ASAP. But I just want to let y'all know that I am only 5 episodes in at this point. So we're back in American, or more specifically New York's high society, dealing with everyone's snobbishness back in the latter half of the 1800s. So of course, we're gonna start off with episode 1. We got George. He's out and about trying to expand his railroad business, but as per usual, he's taking on more than he can chew, and those around him are warning him that he might be putting his business on the brink of a collapse, trying to build this railroad that goes across the country all the way to California. Back in New York, Agnes is still trying to come to terms with her son Oscar losing all their wealth to a scammer named Maud Beaton, who's actually somewhat based on a real woman named Casey Chadwick, who ended up caught up in a lot of fraud with various banks. But anyways, thankfully Ada learned that her husband, Mr. Forte, shortly after his death, had left her with a pretty substantial sum, and now she's who the staff in the house answers to, and is also the one making all the donations and being invited to all the events, while Agnes is now second chair taking Ada's place. But Ada's still dealing with her emotions from losing her husband. Marianne and Larry are really getting close, and so is Gladys to her little flame Billy, but Bertha is pretty much determined to control every aspect of her life as her mother, including who she marries, of course. Another interesting story is Aurora Fane, who's family with the Van Ryns, basically being forced into a divorce by her husband, who's telling her that he's with another woman now and he wants to marry her instead. But she's fighting it and is trying to stay afloat in high society while he tries to make her life a living hell, so she does eventually move to Newport. Jack, the Van Ryn's footman, is hard at work with his clock, which he now had a patent for, but now he was working with Larry to partner with a company to get it produced. This is around the time that we also see that Peggy is getting pretty sick, and from there on she ends up pretty much bedridden, and they eventually have to call for a doctor, which we'll get into. Larry and Gladys discuss when their dad George was supposed to be coming home, because Larry knew that his mother was going to be up to something when the Duke arrived. So Larry questions if she and Billy should just elope, but she wants to know if he'll do the same with Marianne. Oscar is still moping around the house all depressed because he lost his family's fortune, and now Marianne and Ada are trying to push him to get back into investing. In terms of Jack and Larry with the clock though, I was getting a little irritated that Larry didn't want him to be there to answer questions about his clock. Not Larry's, his. Like, Jack, in my opinion, should have been there to talk about his product, not Larry. I feel like he was just there to deal with the business negotiations. When it came to the actual, product setup, you could see that Larry was having a tough time, and it was just frustrating that he was like, I got it. But it was like, just take Jack with you. Like, it's really not that deep. But anyway, eventually Billy's mom blows the lid on the whole secret relationship thing and engagement, and Bertha was just on a rampage since then, and Gladys eventually just decides to run away instead of actually trying to make a plan. Episode 2. So Peggy wasn't really getting any better, and they decided to call on her parents, Arthur and Dorothy Scott, who are pretty affluent black folks in part due to Arthur's pharmacy. Agnes was pretty shocked when her doctor didn't want to see Peggy because he realized that she was black. Not really sure why she was shocked though, considering the times. But they eventually call on a black doctor named Dr. Kirkland, and they get even closer shortly after Peggy gets past her health issues. And I must say, okay, side note, somebody had mentioned this in the comments of a video that I watched over on TikTok. And they were like, listen, I want to see a show based in this time period just about the black elites, because they personally felt like they've never seen a show like that. And I kind of have to agree. I feel like it's always kind of like a mix, which is cool to see, but I want to see it specifically about the black elites. I feel like that would be an interesting show, and I definitely want to see it. But back to our storyline. So Billy's mom, Mrs. Carlton, calls Bertha to tell her that Gladys had come over to the house the night before, but Bertha comes over and she wasn't trying to hear nothing. But Gladys eventually comes back home, and so does George. But you could see that Bertha kind of already got to George by the time as he went to speak with Gladys, because he was trying to convince her that she should consider all of her options, including the Duke. Oscar, on the other hand, he goes back to his lover John, who is born to the presidential Addams family. He decides to give Oscar a little money to invest just to get him back into the game. Mrs. Astor, the queen bee of the New York elites, eventually finds out about Aurora's husband being with another woman, and so does the rest of society, who sees him come to an event with his new chick on his arm. Definitely embarrassing. Billy finally gets his chance to ask for Gladys's hand in marriage from George, and he chickens out and runs away. Later, he explains to Gladys that he's not the man she wanted him to be, but it turns out that Bertha had already made a threat to Mrs. Carlton that she would ruin Billy's life if he tried to move forward with marrying Gladys. But my question is, if they did get married, wouldn't you be ruining Gladys' life as well? But anyways, Arthur and Dorothy have a more in-depth conversation with Agnes on one of their visits to the house to see Peggy as she gets better, and they seem to trust her a little bit more. The broke Duke arrives at the Russells' home to swoop in and ask to marry Gladys after everything with Billy fell through. Episode 3. So the negotiations for what the Duke would get out of his marriage to Gladys monetarily starts going off the rails, and George is not bending to the Duke's demands, which he only got in his head because Bertha was trying to make it seem like he'd get everything and anything that he asked for, and of course more for his estate back in England. So things aren't really looking likely at first between the Duke and Gladys, but for Marianne and Larry it definitely is, and they even get into a little makeout session in the Russells' house, and one of the staff catches them. Now Marianne is starting to spiral because she knows someone's going to tell Bertha eventually, which she's correct. They do, unfortunately. And Bertha already had plans for both Gladys and Larry when it came to who they were going to marry. But now Marianne was getting in the way of that when it comes to Larry. Dr. Kirkland starts writing to Peggy, and her family is getting a little too invested for her liking. But she and Dr. Kirkland do go for a few walkabouts together. Ada, on the other hand, has been on this crusade to get all the alcohol out of the house and wants everyone to sign a pledge to not drink, which she's only able to get Agnes's maid, Miss Armstrong, to sign. But I've never really liked Miss Armstrong, to be honest. She didn't like Peggy because she was black when she first came to the house, and she also didn't want to help Jack pay for the patent for his clock because she didn't see it going anywhere, and made it pretty clear to him that she thought he would fail. The Duke leaves the Russells and sets his sight on a new girl from the Delancey family, but Bertha just couldn't have that, so she talks to the girl's father, Franklin Delancey, to see if she can break this situation up, but it doesn't really do anything. Arthur and Dorothy meet Dr. Kirkland's parents, Frederick and Elizabeth, but Elizabeth keeps throwing shade at them, coming across as very pompous and that she's better than them, with little sprinkles of colorism here and there. Arthur was a freed slave who was a self-made man, and she definitely looked down on that for some reason, so it put a bad taste in the Scots' mouths, but Dorothy was still trying to give her a chance for Peggy's sake. Bertha gets a chance to talk to the Duke, aka Hector, again, and convinces him to give the situation with Gladys another shot, under the guise of Gladys's allowance also being thrown into the pot. George keeps trying to talk her out of doing this, but when Bertha wants something, I've realized that she's going to step on everyone's toes and feelings to get it. So the Duke comes back to the Russells' house, and Gladys is less than thrilled, but she goes along with it. And back at the Van Ryan's house, Ada comes to Mrs. Bauer, the cook, to see why the other staff members didn't sign her no alcohol agreement, because ultimately she just wanted to honor her late husband, Mr. Forte, but then she reveals that she just really misses him, and Mrs. Bauer tells her about the clairvoyant that she knew, and I just don't see this ending well. But back at the Russells, George is trying to convince Gladys to hear the Duke out, And the Duke also seems pretty nice, at least for now. So Gladys accepts his marriage proposal, but she seems pretty traumatized low-key. Of course, Bertha is ecstatic and they reveal Gladys's portrait and also share the news of her engagement to the Duke. And I think that her popping her choker pearl necklace in this case was just very telling, and it kind of gives us some foreshadowing into how her life is about to play out. Just feeling like people are controlling her so much to the point where it feels like it's hard to breathe because someone's always down her neck. Episode 4. Jack tells the staff he and Larry got a letter from the company they pitched to, and they push him to go and hear for himself what their decision was in terms of his clock. But it turns out that they wanted to purchase the clock from him, and they offered them $600K, which was worth around $18 million back in the 1800s. So Jack would be leaving the deal with half of that after Larry got his cut. But he tells no one except for Miss Bauer, who keeps his secret for a bit until he figures out what he wants to do with his life moving forward, because he was so used to just working all the time. Ada finally invites his clairvoyant over to the house, and she just babbles on about things that anyone could have honestly made up, but Ada is just pretty much eating everything up. Agnes catches them, and I just have a feeling that she's about to blow all her money on this stuff because she wants to connect with her husband so badly. Bertha's sister Carrie comes to town to stay with them for the wedding, and Bertha is definitely not happy about it because she's clearly not as bougie as Bertha is and doesn't dress like it either. At dinner, she starts asking the Duke and his sister a whole lot of questions, even about her potentially moving out of the family home since her brother and Gladys were going to be married. But I'm happy that Carrie was at least asking questions because George and Bertha just seem to be mute in this department for some strange reason, even though their daughter was about to be moving halfway across the country with this man. But anyway, she ends up spilling some tea or coffee on her dress, but it seems like Bertha orchestrated this situation so that Carrie would wear something that she had for the wedding. And Marianne has to end up being called in as the positive voice for Gladys on her wedding day because she doesn't want to come out of her room. And surprisingly, Bertha had to suck up her pride and call on her to speak to Gladys and also replace a bridesmaid last minute. Things are pretty much falling apart with George's expansion, and his investors are pulling out one by one. Mrs. Astor has to deal with a little scandal herself when news of her daughter's husband setting up a duel with who he thought was her lover kind of blows up. So now Mrs. Astor was kind of scared of her potentially getting a divorce, so she basically told her, yeah, you're not coming with me to Gladys's wedding because you're not going to make me look bad. Bertha is still freaking out that Gladys won't come out of her room, so George comes in to give her a pep talk, but also to tell her that they were past the point of return and she had to either marry the Duke or walk away and risk the family name being scandalized. So George waits for her at the bottom of the stairs and she comes down in her dress. They arrive at the church, and as they walk down the aisle, Gladys's face, y'all, she just looked terrified the whole time. Afterwards, Gladys and the Duke get on a ship headed back to England, and her lady's maid, Adelheid, goes with her. Gladys gets ready for her wedding night with the Duke, and he seems super eager, almost like he didn't really care about her feelings, but was trying to make it seem like he did. But he was like, yeah, I just want to get it out the way. And I'm like, this is a really special moment for her. Like, don't just make this seem like something that needs to get out of the way. You know, it's just weird. Episode 5. Gladys and the Duke get to his estate in England, and they're greeted by all of his tenants and farmhands, but when they get to the house, his sister pretty much takes over and pretends like Gladys doesn't even exist and only her money does. Back in New York, things are heating up between Peggy and Dr. Kirkland. They attend a baseball game, and she unfortunately spots Mr. Fortune, the man who she ended up getting romantically involved with after working on some newspaper segment together, but he ended up being married with kids. Crazy work. But this meeting is pretty awkward because Dr. Kirkland could tell that there's something going on between them, or at least used to, and he knows nothing about it. Mr. Fortune invites her to interview Frances Harper in Philadelphia, who's been at the front lines of the fight for women, and more specifically, women of color, trying to give them the right to vote. She tells him the address to send the information to, and his child comes over to remind her that again, this man was married with kids. George, on the other hand, is battling with his counsel with regards to purchasing more land for his railroad expansion, but then he fires his counsel who was trying to tell him what he was doing was kind of dumb and could lead to major financial ruin. He invites Alfred Merrick over and has Bertha charm him because he needed to buy some land from him for his expansion, but Bertha does a little too good of a job and George starts getting a little jealous. Peggy gets a train ticket to head over to Philadelphia and she tells Agnes at the same time, but Marianne makes things kind of awkward when she asks her if it's wise to go since the opportunity came from Mr. Fortune and she knows all about that situation. But Peggy is the type of person that doesn't really like when people question her about her decisions or put their nose too deep in her business. And I'm definitely that type of person, so I can relate. George tries to recruit Larry to come with him to handle business for the railroad, but Larry reveals that he wanted to propose to Marianne before he left, and George was excited and even told him that he would speak to his mom, Bertha, on his behalf. Larry proposes to Marianne and she accepts, but considering she had 2 other failed proposals in the past, there's a lot riding on this, so I hope nothing happens to Larry on his trip with his dad. But they share the news with Ada and Agnes, who have 2 different reactions, but they're both still happy for her in their own way. Larry also reveals to them that he and Jack had sold the clock, so Jack was now pretty rich, and news travels to the rest of the staff, so now everyone knows. Gladys gets ready for her first dinner as Duchess, and the Duke's sister is upset that she's wearing star pins in her hair instead of a tiara. And the next day, his sister makes it a point to fire Gladys's maid, Adelheid, but I'm trying to figure out how she had the authority to do that when she, number 1, wasn't even her lady's maid, and number 2, technically that was the Duke and Gladys's home, not hers. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, so the Duke tries to tell his sister to lay off of Gladys, but Gladys writes to her parents anyway to try to get this situation cleared up and also to tell them how miserable things are. Larry and Marianne share the news with George and Bertha is pretty upset that she was the last to know about it and had no hand to play in picking his fiance for him. Later that evening, Larry had promised Jack he was going to take him out to celebrate the clock, and that's where Larry spots none other than Maud Beaton. The woman that swindled wealthy people out of their money under the guise of it being an investment. But she pretends not to know who Larry's even talking about when he comes over to confront her, and she claims her name is Dolly Trent and she didn't know who Maud was. After Larry says his goodbyes to Marianne, he tells Oscar that he saw Maud the night before working at the Haymarket, which I guess was some type of gentleman's club. Oscar passes this news back to John and he tells him that he wants to meet with her for answers, but personally, I don't think Oscar is going to be getting any response that's going to ease the pain of being stolen from. Peggy is about to leave for Philadelphia when Mr. Fortune walks into the station, but Dr. Kirkland was already there, and apparently Mr. Fortune was trying to join Peggy for the interview, but didn't mention that to Peggy. Dr. Kirkland questions why Mr. Fortune can't just let Peggy go alone, and things kind of pop off a bit, and Peggy has to break things up between Mr. Fortune and Dr. Kirkland. Aurora is still dealing with her divorce, but decides to go out with Marianne to lunch where she ends up not really being accepted, but Bertha makes it clear that she's in support of her because she knows how it feels to be an outcast. Since it took her and her family a minute to even be accepted into high society since they were technically new money, Aurora decides to leave the lunch party with Marianne because of Mrs. Astor, but now Mrs. Fish, a friend to both Bertha and Mrs. Astor, decides to speak up and put pressure on Mrs. Astor to either bring Aurora back into the circle or she would be forced to cast out her own daughter as well if she gets a divorce, since that's what she was doing to Aurora and that would only be fair. The episode ends with George blaming Bertha for Gladys's misery in England, and now Bertha thinks that she can solve this mess, but even though she did have a big part to play in orchestrating this marriage, I honestly think that George shouldn't be let off scot-free. He could have easily put his foot down while all of this was happening as the father and head of the household and said no to Gladys even marrying this dude. So everything shouldn't be put on your wife in this situation, sir. You are partially to blame. But anywho, after that long recap, I don't have too much to say outside of the fact that this is shaping up to be one hell of a season. The first 2 seasons were good, but this one is looking really interesting. All the characters have something going on and have their own plot or storyline to work through, and I really enjoy that they have quite a number of them based on the lives of real people in history. And I think I'm most excited to see what happens with Peggy, Marianne, and Gladys. Bertha is kind of the villain, but I also understand why she did what she did, but it was still villainous in my opinion. So let me know in the comments what your favorite scenes or who have been your favorite characters so far in this season down in the comments. I'll catch y'all the next one.